The sun-drenched kitchen of Sarah Kincaid's home in Havenwood was usually a place of gentle chaos, and this Tuesday morning was no exception. Her 2-year-old, Lily, sat in her high chair, vigorously drumming her spoon against the plastic tray, a joyful, tuneless rhythm. Sarah, still half asleep despite the bright light pouring through the window, reached for the milk carton. Her fingers, slick with condensation, fumbled. The carton slipped. A slow-motion splash, white rivulets spreading across the linoleum, a dairy tide lapping at the pantry door. "Oh, for crying out loud," Sarah muttered, a sigh escaping her lips. It wasn't a disaster, just another minor hurdle in the obstacle course of a toddler's morning. She fetched a roll of paper towels, already dreading the sticky cleanup. Her husband, Mark, clomped in from the bedroom, a cheerful whistle dying in his throat as his eyes landed on the milky puddle. "Whoa, disaster zone." He chuckled, reaching for the mop Sarah had just pulled from the closet. He took a step onto the wet floor, his socked foot seeking purchase, but found none. His arms windmilled wildly for a split second, a cartoonish attempt to regain balance, before he landed with a sickening thud, a sharp cry, then a groan. Sarah dropped the paper towels. "Mark, are you okay?" He sat up, clutching his ankle, his face contorted. "Think I twisted it," he gritted out, already trying to put weight on it and immediately pulling back with another yelp. Clearly, it was more than a twist. A quick visual inspection confirmed it. His ankle was already swelling, an angry purplish hue blooming under the skin. Urgent care, no question. The frantic rush that followed felt like a blur. Getting Lily out of the high chair, finding Mark's keys, wrestling him into the passenger seat of their old sedan. Sarah's heart hammered, a dull drum against her ribs. The short drive into town felt endless, each bump of the road sending a wince through Mark. She was nearing the main intersection, a familiar stretch of asphalt just past Miller's Hardware, when the steering wheel gave a sudden jerk. A low, ominous thud vibrated through the floorboards, followed by a rhythmic thwopping. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Mark groaned, staring at her. "A flat?" Sarah pulled over, her hands tight on the wheel. A quick glance confirmed their luck. The front passenger tire was completely deflated, kissing the pavement like a fallen souffle. Just what they needed, with Mark unable to help and Lily strapped in the back. Calling roadside assistance was their only option. The wait was long, the late morning sun beating down on their stranded vehicle, adding another layer of sweat-soaked frustration to their day. By the time they were finally towed home, Mark's ankle wrapped, Lily was cranky and crying for her afternoon nap. Sarah led them inside, the front door ajar from their hasty departure, the house unnervingly quiet. It was only when she went to soothe Lily, rocking her gently in the dim light of her bedroom, that the silence truly solidified into something cold and wrong. Lily whimpered, reaching for her crib. "Thumper! Want Thumper!" Sarah glanced at the crib, then around the room. Thumper, Lily's beloved, raggedy stuffed rabbit, was nowhere in sight. She searched, first casually, then with increasing urgency, pulling back blankets, peeking under furniture. It wasn't on the floor, not in the toy box. Growing a knot in her stomach, Sarah checked the living room, the kitchen, retracing their steps from that chaotic morning. Nothing. Then, she saw it, propped against the glass of the storm door, facing inward, as if watching them, sat Thumper. His button eyes seemed to gleam in the fading light. He was perfectly clean, perfectly still, his usually grubby fur spotless. Sarah stared, a chill prickling her skin. The front door had been left ajar, yes, but not the storm door. That had been latched, and the rabbit had been in Lily's crib just hours ago. Who or what could have placed it there? The thought made her stomach clench with an unnerving, icy dread. Evelyn Reed clicked her pen against the laminated syllabus, the rhythmic tap echoing faintly in her empty classroom. Morning light, filtered through the dusty blinds of Havenwood High, cast long, uninspired rectangles across the scuffed linoleum. The faint scent of stale coffee and industrial-strength cleaner clung to the air, a familiar backdrop to her Tuesday mornings. Evelyn was an English teacher, 20-something years into the profession, and today's lesson felt particularly academic. "Cause and effect," she murmured. reviewing the bullet points on her smartboard. It was foundational, necessary, but rarely sparked the kind of intellectual fire she lived for. She wrote the definition. A cause happens first. It's why something happens. An effect happens after the cause. It tells us what happened. She remembered the classic examples. It rained. Carolina got wet. Or Phil stayed up late. Phil was tired in the morning. Simple, clear, contained. Life, she thought, rarely presented such neat equations. People often looked for a clean line from A to B, but Havenwood, like any small town, understood that the connections were messier, more tangled, or at least they used to. Lately, though, an unsettling current seemed to ripple beneath the town's placid surface, a quiet hum of unease that wasn't quite fear, not yet, but something akin to a prickle on the back of the neck. She'd heard Mrs. Henderson at the grocery store last week, whispering about the Reese family's bizarre streak of misfortune, a series of escalating accidents that had culminated in, well, Evelyn didn't like to dwell on specifics. It was just an exceptionally bad run, everyone agreed. Bad luck, pure and simple. But her mind drifted back to her lesson plan. To find the cause, ask, why did this happen? She recited to herself, imagining the blank stares of her sophomore class. The effect answers, what happened? She'd planned to introduce signal words, those literary breadcrumbs that guided a reader through cause and effect relationships. So, because, due to, since, if. She'd even prepared a few local examples, innocuous ones, to make it relatable. Mrs. Albright forgot to water her petunias, so they wilted. Billy missed the bus because his alarm didn't go off. The mundane fabric of Havenwood life. Evelyn walked to her desk, picking up a dog-eared copy of The Great Gatsby, another text rich with unspoken causes and devastating effects. She traced the faded cover with her thumb. It was her job to teach her students to spot these connections, to understand how one event could inevitably lead to another. She believed in logic, in predictable outcomes. She believed in the steady, rational order of things. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, shaking the window panes. A gust of wind rattled the old oak tree by the fence line, dislodging a handful of dry leaves that scattered across the asphalt. Evelyn watched them drift, remembering the unnerving quiet that had descended over Mrs. Reese's cul-de-sac last week. A peculiar silence that had followed too many loud, sudden noises. She shivered. Despite the warmth of the Texas morning, her lesson, she decided, needed to be especially clear today. The more precise her students were at identifying causes and effects, the better they would understand the world. If only, she thought, the world itself played by such simple rules. She had no idea how precisely her quiet town was about to illustrate them. The bell for lunch period had just rung, leaving Evelyn's classroom momentarily quiet save for the rustle of papers. She was still thinking about the morning's lesson, the way some of her students had struggled with the difference between cause and effect. It felt so fundamental, yet the abstract nature of it always tripped a few up. Just as she gathered her things, a small figure appeared at her desk, shoulders hunched. Miss Reed? It was Tyler, usually a diligent kid, a quiet presence in the back row. Evelyn offered a warm smile. Yes, Tyler? He chewed on his lip, his gaze fixed on his worn sneakers. I forgot my essay, Miss Reed, the one due today. Evelyn felt a familiar sigh well up inside her, but she swallowed it. Not the end of the world. All right, Tyler. That's a missed assignment for now, but you can turn it in first thing tomorrow for partial credit. She scribbled a note on her clipboard. Try to remember it next time, okay? Tyler mumbled an apology, his face flushed, and scurried out. Evelyn shook her head good-naturedly. Kids. Always something. Forgotten homework. Spilled juice in the cafeteria. Little hiccups in the day's rhythm. She chalked it up to a momentary lapse, a common cause leading to a common effect. Later that afternoon, a strange sight stopped her cold as she walked toward the faculty parking lot. Principal Miller, a man whose meticulously manicured rose garden was the pride of Havenwood High, stood by a flower bed near the main entrance. He wasn't admiring them. His usually jovial face was a mask of disbelief, tinged with a raw, almost childish grief. The roses. His famous prize-winning hybrid tea roses, usually a vibrant tapestry of crimson and blush, were a grotesque spectacle of decay. Petals lay shriveled and crisp on the dark soil. Leaves curled inward, brittle and brown. It looked less like natural wilting, and more like something had aggressively sucked the life out of them in a matter of hours. The vibrant life had been choked, replaced by a sudden, unnatural desiccation. "Principal Miller," Evelyn approached cautiously. He didn't seem to hear her at first, his eyes wide, fixed on a particularly gnarled stem. My Duchess de Brabant," he murmured, his voice hoarse. "They were fine this morning. Perfect. Every single one." Evelyn looked at the extent of the damage. It was systemic. Not a single bloom had been spared the inexplicable blight. A chill traced its way up her spine. The image of Tyler, head bowed, admitting his forgotten essay, flashed through her mind. Then, the sudden, inexplicable demise of the principal's prize roses. No, she thought, pushing the thought away. That was ridiculous. One had absolutely nothing to do with the other. Just an odd coincidence. A fluke of nature, certainly. Havenwood was a small town, and strange things happened. Bad luck struck. She told herself that, but the unsettling connection, like a faint, dissonant chord, resonated in the back of her mind. The observation lingered. A tiny, sharp burr under her skin. Dale Albright, with his practiced smile and perfectly coiffed silver hair, stood before the Havenwood Doppler radar on WHTV Channel 8. It was prime time, and he was in his element, the local authority on all things meteorological. He gestured confidently at a swirling green blob on the screen. "Now, folks, we've got a little disturbance brewing down in Sonora, trying its darndest to make its way up here." He chuckled, a sound as smooth as the hairspray holding his hair in place. "But let me tell you, I wouldn't bet your grandmother's heirloom tomatoes on it making it to Havenwood. Not a drop. Not tonight. I'd eat my own umbrella if this front so much as sprinkles our little town." He winked at the camera. "You can take that to the bank." Later that evening, Dale pulled his polished Ford F-150 into his driveway on Elm Street. He admired his freshly mowed lawn, the petunias vibrant under the porch light, not a cloud in the sky. He had a moment of self-satisfaction, thinking of his confident forecast. He was practically humming as he reached for his house keys. The air was still, quiet, exactly as he'd predicted. Then, he heard it. A single heavy drop splatted onto the windshield. He paused, looking up. The sky was clear, studded with stars, an inky canvas without blemish. He looked down at his truck. Another drop, and another. Soon, a distinct pattering sound began, growing louder, like a sudden, localized showerhead had been turned on directly over his property. It defied all logic, all meteorological understanding. Dale stared, bewildered, as rain cascaded from a patch of perfectly clear sky directly onto his front yard. It was a perfect rectangle of water, soaking his manicured lawn, his prize-winning rose bushes, the very umbrella he had offered to eat. The stream running along the curb of his property was bone dry. His neighbor, Mrs. Gable, watched from her own porch, her face a mask of confusion. Her perfectly identical lawn, just 10 feet away, remaining untouched, dusty, and parched. He stood there, mouth agape, the drizzle thickening, his expensive suit jacket quickly becoming soaked. He stood there, realizing the chilling precision of it all. The water, cold and insistent, felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a deliberate, chilling rebuke. He had made a flippant remark, laughed it off on air, and now the weather itself seemed to be calling his bluff, singling him out. It wasn't just rain. It was an accusation, a precise and personal counterstatement. He felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from the unnerving certainty that this wasn't coincidence. Havenwood was starting to feel less like home, and more like a place under some unseen, watchful eye. He looked at his sodden umbrella, lying uselessly on the porch. He didn't feel like eating it. He felt like apologizing to the sky itself. The air in Evelyn Reed's English 4th classroom felt thick and humid. A typical Havenwood afternoon where even the hum of the old fluorescent lights seemed to sweat. On the whiteboard, she'd drawn a large arrow connecting 2 columns, cause and effect. Below, she'd written several sentences for her students to dissect. "All right, focus, people," Evelyn said, tapping a marker against the board. "Let's try this one. Wendy was feeling sick, so she stayed home from school. Who can tell me the signal word and then identify the cause and effect?" A few hands went up tentatively. Tommy Henderson, always a good sport, offered, "So is the signal word, Miss Reed. And the cause is Wendy feeling sick, because that's why she stayed home." Evelyn nodded, forcing a smile. "Excellent, Tommy. And the effect, then, is her staying home." She wrote the answers on the board, but the word "so" seemed to hang in the air, echoing. So. A tiny, insignificant word, yet suddenly charged. She thought of Kevin Miller, the principal, and his prized rose bushes, now nothing but brittle brown sticks. A student, Chad, had forgotten his homework, so the roses withered. The logical connection made no sense, not in the way her textbooks described, but it had happened. She had witnessed it firsthand. The event wasn't a cause for the wilting, it was simply before, but the "so" connected them in a way that felt increasingly real, increasingly menacing. Next, she moved to another example. The swimming carnival was canceled due to bad weather. "Due to" is the signal phrase, offered Sarah Jenkins, her brow furrowed in concentration. And the cause is the bad weather. The effect is the carnival being canceled. Again, Evelyn confirmed the answer, but the phrase "due to" caught in her throat. Jim, the weatherman, his flippant remark about a storm, due to his offhand comment. A precise, localized downpour had soaked in kneading only his yard. It wasn't just bad weather, it was bad weather, targeted by an offhand remark. The cause and effect, in Jim's case, felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like a cruel, direct consequence. She looked at her students, their faces earnest, struggling to grasp the abstract concepts of why and what happened next. Meanwhile, those very concepts, embodied by the signal words, "so," "because," "due to," "if," "since," were crystallizing into something tangible, something terrifying, in her own mind. The words were no longer just tools for understanding text. They were the very threads that seemed to bind Havenwood together in an increasingly strange tapestry. Every mundane occurrence, every casual statement, every forgotten task seemed to ripple outwards, triggering precise, disproportionate effects. Evelyn looked down at her lesson plan. The neat bullet points about identifying relationships. If you study hard, you'll get better grades. Forget to use sunscreen, you'll get sunburnt. Innocent examples, pedagogical and straightforward. But the events in Havenwood weren't straightforward. They weren't about natural consequences. They were something else. A chill snaked its way up her spine despite the classroom's stuffy heat. The children were hungry because they hadn't eaten all day. Since the class worked so hard, the teacher suggested a game. Max said he'd cancel the race if the track was wet. These simple linguistic connectors, designed to bring clarity, now brought only a growing sense of dread. Evelyn stood there, realizing the words weren't just describing the fabric of reality, they were beginning to dictate it in Havenwood, and the implications were terrifying. The scent of stale coffee and frying bacon usually offered a comforting blanket inside the Havenwood diner, a familiar smell Evelyn had associated with weekend mornings and gossip. Today, it felt heavier, almost suffocating. She sat at a small booth by the window, nursing a lukewarm refill, the clinking of cutlery sounding unusually sharp in the muted hum of conversation. The usual boisterous chatter was replaced by hushed tones and nervous glances, like a storm brewing just out of sight. At the counter, two men, mill workers by the looks of their faded overalls, leaned in close. Evelyn couldn't help but catch snippets. "Joe Henderson," one mumbled, shaking his head, "lost his job, just like that. Because he told Miller the new safety vests made everyone look like overgrown pumpkins." "No kidding?" the other responded, eyes wide. "Over a joke?" "Said he made light of company policy, directly undermining authority. Pink slip by lunch." The first man took a long drag from his cigarette, the smoke curling around his weary face. Can you believe it? Just because he opened his big mouth. Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the diner's AC, because the word echoed, a hollow clang in her mind, linking Joe's abrupt unemployment to his careless remark. It wasn't just a simple, unfortunate occurrence. It was too precise, too immediate. She remembered Principal Miller's prize-winning roses withering the very day her student forgot their homework, or the local weatherman's own property getting soaked after he'd flippantly dismissed a forecast. These weren't flukes anymore. A little later, Betty, the waitress with the ever-present smile that now seemed a little strained, stopped by Evelyn's table. "Rough week, huh, Miss Reed?" she asked, refilling the coffee. "Did you hear about Billy Gable? Poor kid broke his arm." Evelyn shook her head. "No, what happened?" "Fell right outside his house, slipped on a patch of wet grass." "Freak thing, really," Betty said, polishing the counter with a practiced motion. "His mom, Martha, she's beside herself. It happened right after he missed his dental appointment. Martha had rescheduled it 3 times, but this time, he just totally forgot." Evelyn blinked. After he missed, due to him forgetting, another signal word, screaming silently in her head. A forgotten appointment, a broken arm. It was a cruel, disproportionate balance. The town was starting to feel like a carefully constructed equation, each action spawning an undeniable, often punitive reaction. "Just seems like a run of bad luck, don't it?" Betty sighed, wiping down the sugar dispenser. "First the Millers, then that rain on Ted Miller's lawn, now Joe and Billy. Havenwood's got a dark cloud over it. Bad luck, the townspeople called it. A dark cloud." But Evelyn felt a deeper current, something cold and magical binding these incidents together, weaving an invisible net around them all. It wasn't luck, it was consequence. Amplified and absolute, demanding payment for every careless word, every forgotten obligation. And the unease, an unsettling awareness of these growing connections, had begun to bind Evelyn herself. The unsettling hum of the diner still resonated in Evelyn Reed's ears, days after she'd overheard the whispers. Job losses due to a careless word, broken bones from a forgotten appointment. It wasn't just bad luck anymore. It was too precise, too immediate. She kept seeing the pattern, the terrifying logic of it, like the twisted inverse of her classroom's if-then statements. What if the signal words weren't just about understanding text, but about understanding a force that was actively shaping their world? Her car rattled down Willow Creek Lane, heading towards the edge of Havenwood, where Mr. Henderson lived. The old historian was the town's unofficial memory keeper, a man whose porch sagged under the weight of generations of forgotten stories. He was known for his eccentricities, his house overflowing with dusty tomes and forgotten artifacts. But Evelyn hoped he might have a different kind of answer. She found him on his porch swing, a thin, spectacled man with a wild halo of white hair, hunched over a leather-bound book. He blinked, peering at her over the rim of his glasses. "Evelyn Reed, to what do I owe this? What scholarly visit?" His voice was a dry rustle, like old leaves. Evelyn sat on the creaking step, clasping her hands. She explained it all. The wilting roses, the localized downpour, the increasingly severe consequences, the way so, because, and due to felt like keys to a terrifying lock. She spoke about the current of unease she'd felt binding the town, the unspoken dread that something was watching, waiting to enforce. Mr. Henderson listened intently, his gaze drifting from her face to the weathered wood of his porch, then to the distant, perfectly normal Havenwood skyline. When she finished, a long silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the chirping of cicadas. "There's old folklore," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something my great-grandmother used to fret over. They called it the binding. Not a deity, not a spirit, but a practice, a way of living," they said. From the earliest days of Havenwood, before it was even called Havenwood. He paused, a faraway look in his eyes. The old settlers believed that communal harmony wasn't just wished for, it had to be enforced. Every action, every word, had its consequence. Not just moral consequence, mind you, but physical, undeniable, absolute consequence. If you were careless with your tools, you might find your own hand suddenly clumsy, breaking a bone. If you spoke ill of a neighbor, your own words would turn against you, spoiling your harvest. Evelyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Absolute consequence," she repeated, the words tasting like ash. "Exactly. Mr. Henderson nodded, his gaze now fixed on her, suddenly sharp. They believed it ensured a sort of brutal justice, kept everyone in line. If someone broke faith, if they caused harm, either by malice or by sheer oversight, the effect would rebound, magnified, upon them. It was meant to make everyone meticulous, thoughtful, and ultimately, deeply connected by shared fear of repercussion. But it's just folklore, right? Evelyn asked, though her heart pounded with a terrible certainty. She stood there, realizing the truth of it, witnessing it firsthand in every story she'd heard. This wasn't just a pattern. It was a system, forgotten but clearly not gone. Mr. Henderson closed his ancient book with a soft thud, a faint puff of dust rising. They called it the binding, Miss Reed, because once enacted, once woven into the fabric of the community, it bound them all, for good or ill. His eyes held a deep, ancient worry, and sometimes things that are forgotten don't truly disappear. They merely wait. The late afternoon sun cast long, lazy shadows across Havenwood's main street, but no amount of golden light could quite dispel the growing chill Evelyn felt. She sat at a window booth in Martha's diner, nursing a lukewarm iced tea, pretending to grade papers. In reality, her gaze kept drifting to the street, observing. Every casual exchange, every minor misstep, now felt charged with a silent, terrifying potential. Yesterday, she'd seen it unfold. Frank Miller, the new guy who ran the auto parts store, had been backing out of his driveway, distracted by a phone call. He'd barely looked over his shoulder. Because he wasn't paying attention, his old pickup had scraped down the side of Mrs. Gable's pristine sedan. A loud, metallic screech, then a groan of brakes. No one was hurt, just a nasty dent and a shattered taillight. Frank had been profusely apologetic, promising to cover the repairs. A careless act, certainly, but hardly catastrophic. A fender bender, nothing more. Today, Evelyn heard the rest of it. Frank, looking pale and haggard, had stopped by the diner earlier, visibly shaken. He'd recounted the story to Martha, not once, but twice. "My whole engine," he'd said, his voice a low growl of disbelief. "Just seized up. Blew a rod, a piston, everything." The mechanic said he'd never seen anything like it. No warning, no apparent fault. Frank had called it a fluke, the worst luck he'd ever had. Martha had clucked sympathetically, offering a free slice of apple pie. But Evelyn saw the pattern. She stood there, realizing the unnerving link. Frank's carelessness yesterday had caused minor damage to Mrs. Gable's car. So today, his own vehicle suffered a devastating, inexplicable failure. It wasn't proportionate. It was amplified, precise, and undeniably linked. The principal's wilting roses, the weatherman's personal storm, the sudden job loss because of a thoughtless remark, the broken bone due to a forgotten appointment. Mr. Henderson's words about the binding, a forgotten practice of absolute consequence, echoed in her mind. This was no fluke. This was the unseen hand, tightening its grip on Havenwood. Evelyn watched Frank outside, pacing by his tow-trucked pickup. His phone call seemed to be going nowhere. She recognized the look on his face, a dawning realization that this wasn't just bad luck. It was too direct, too immediate, too severe. The consequences were escalating, not just in magnitude, but in their chilling exactness. A specific action, a specific and often disproportionate repercussion. She thought of her students, struggling with cause and effect. Because of the rain, Carolina got wet, so Phil was tired. These relationships were becoming a brutal living grammar in Havenwood, written in the shattered mechanics of an engine, the wilting petals of a rose, the deep dread in Frank Miller's eyes. The town was caught in the middle of it, unwitting participants in a horrifying lesson. And Evelyn, for the first time, felt the binding thread cinch around her own throat. The whispers in Havenwood had turned to strained silence. Evelyn felt it in the hallways, saw it in the guarded eyes of her students. Mr. Henderson's chilling tale of the binding wasn't folklore anymore. It was the unseen hand that had crushed Mr. Davison's car engine the day after his fender bender. Cause and effect, once a simple lesson, was now a predatory force, sniffing out opportunities, ready to pounce. Evelyn, an English teacher by trade, a scientist at heart, found herself wanting to test its limits. Could it truly be unbreakable? She got her chance during second period. She saw it building, a low simmering resentment between Mike Rodriguez and Lisa Chen over a shared English textbook. Mike, always a bit too possessive, had snatched it from Lisa, leaving her fuming. The usual trajectory was clear. A sharp retort, a raised voice, maybe a quick trip to the principal's office. A minor, but noticeable ripple in the school day. Evelyn knew how this script typically went. As Lisa balled her fists, ready to unleash a string of words Evelyn was sure would lead to a full-blown argument, Evelyn stepped in. She approached their desks calmly, a neutral expression on her face. "Everything all right here, kids?" she asked. Her voice even. Before either could fully launch their complaints, she interjected. "Tell you what, I have a spare copy of The Great Gatsby in my cabinet. Mike, why don't you use that for the rest of class? No need to share if it's causing friction." She saw the surprise on their faces. The tension, poised to snap, deflated like a leaky balloon. Mike grumbled, but accepted the book. Lisa, still radiating annoyance, was quiet. Evelyn felt a flicker of triumph. She'd identified the immediate cause, the shared textbook and the rising frustration, and removed it. She had successfully averted the argument, the expected effect. She'd broken the chain, or so she thought. The rest of the period passed without incident. Evelyn taught her lesson on symbolism, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. Had she really done it? Had she outsmarted the binding? The thought felt almost sacrilegious, tempting fate. Later that afternoon, the shrill sound of the recess bell pierced the air. Evelyn was gathering her things when a sudden commotion erupted from the playground visible through her window. A cluster of students, then a frantic dash from the supervising teacher. Evelyn hurried out, her stomach clenching. She pushed through the small crowd to see two figures on the ground, tangled in a messy, furious brawl. It was Mike and Lisa. Their faces were red, streaked with dirt, their clothes torn. Other students stood by, wide-eyed and shocked. This was no petty squabble over a book. This was raw, untamed fury. "What happened?" Evelyn demanded of the nearest student. Mike called Lisa a cheater in kickball. The boy mumbled, eyes still glued to the wrestling figures. And Lisa said he was a hog. Then it just exploded. Evelyn watched, horrified, as the supervising teacher finally pulled them apart. Mike had a bloody nose, Lisa a scraped arm. The argument Evelyn had prevented earlier that morning, the one that should have diffused harmlessly, had been redirected. It hadn't been prevented at all. It had merely been delayed, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a new, trivial spark to ignite a far more destructive blaze. The effect hadn't been canceled. It had simply found a twisted, amplified pathway to manifest. The iron grip of the binding tightened around Evelyn's heart, a chilling testament to its ruthless, inescapable logic. There were truly no exceptions. Principal Miller, a man of facts and figures who prided himself on his unflappable demeanor, strode to the podium in the Havenwood High Auditorium. The air hummed with an unspoken tension. He clapped his hands together once, a sharp, decisive sound that was meant to dispel the growing unease in the room, but only served to tighten the collective knot in everyone's stomach. Evelyn sat in the fifth row, her gaze fixed on him, a fresh wave of dread washing over her. She knew what he represented, and she knew it was a dangerous stance to take in this town now. "Folks, I understand the anxieties," Miller began, his voice calm, measured. He surveyed the faces, many of them strained and fearful, but we're a community of reason. What we're experiencing is a run of bad luck, pure and simple. There's no cosmic force at play, no binding, as some of the more imaginative among us have suggested. He glanced pointedly at the back row, where Mr. Henderson usually sat, but the historian was conspicuously absent. Miller scoffed, a short, dismissive sound that grated on Evelyn's nerves. The wilted roses, Mr. Henderson's tall tales, a leaky roof that causes a spill. These are not connected by some grand, unseen design. They are everyday occurrences, amplified by mass hysteria. He leaned slightly on the podium, pushing his weight onto one hand. "If you ask me, the only cause and effect we need to worry about is a good night's sleep, leading to clear thinking. Because frankly, we're letting our imaginations run wild." Just as he delivered his final cynical remark, a faint drip, drip, drip began from somewhere inside the podium. Miller, mid-gesture, ignored it. He reached for the water pitcher beside him, a standard-issue plastic jug, and took a confident swig. As he lowered it, a small crack, invisible until now, widened slightly, and a thin stream of water trickled down the side of the pitcher onto the wooden surface of the podium. The drip met an exposed patch of wiring on the ancient microphone stands, a flaw Miller had often complained about but never bothered to fix, citing budget cuts. There was a sudden, ear-splitting screech of feedback, a high-pitched whine that cut through the silence like a rusty saw. Everyone flinched. Miller, startled, recoiled from the microphone, tripping over his own 2 feet. He stumbled backward, arms flailing, and in slow motion, Evelyn watched as his hip collided with the pitcher. The plastic jug toppled, sending a cascade of water over the podium, over the now-dead microphone, and soaking the front of Miller's pristine suit. His carefully prepared speech notes, handwritten on index cards, floated uselessly in the shallow puddle. A murmur rippled through the auditorium. Principal Miller, soaked and disheveled, stood there dripping, his usually immaculate hair plastered to his forehead. He looked less like a bastion of common sense, and more like a bewildered, bedraggled scarecrow. His face, crimson with humiliation, showed a dawning comprehension, perhaps for the first time, of the very logic he had just dismissed. Evelyn watched, a chill prickling her skin. It wasn't random. Each minor oversight, each dismissive word, had been a stone kicked, sending ripples that had just drowned their cynic in front of the entire town. The silence in Havenwood was a new kind of heavy, not the comfortable quiet of a small town, but the tense hush of a place holding its breath. Every creak of floorboard, every rustle of leaves outside, felt amplified, scrutinized. It was as if the very air had become an auditor, waiting to catch a misstep. People moved differently now. At the Havenwood General Store, Mrs. Gable paused, her hand hovering over a can of peaches. She didn't just pick it up. She replayed the motion in her head, ensuring her fingers wouldn't slip, wouldn't knock a display, wouldn't cause some unforeseen calamity to ripple back to her family. Her husband, Mr. Gable, had snapped a shoelace yesterday, and that afternoon, a key component in his tractor's engine had inexplicably shattered. Everyone knew it wasn't just bad luck anymore. Evelyn Reed saw it in her classroom. Students who had once been boisterous now spoke in muted tones, careful phrases. A dropped pencil wasn't just a dropped pencil, it was a potential spark. Little Timmy Henderson, usually a whirlwind of restless energy, stood rigidly beside his desk for a full minute, calculating the safest trajectory for his crayon before he even dared to lower it to the paper. The idea of an if-then statement wasn't just an academic exercise anymore. It was the cruel, ironclad law governing their existence. If Timmy dropped his crayon carelessly, then what would be the cost? On Main Street, the usual chatter of neighbors had dwindled to terse greetings. Folks kept their eyes down, or if they met another's gaze, it was fleeting, wary. A careless word, a flippant comment, could be the trigger. They had all witnessed Principal Miller's recent public embarrassment, an intricate tapestry of minor mishaps weaving together into a spectacle that no one in Havenwood would soon forget. His dismissive attitude about the binding had come with a steep, undeniable price. The local diner, usually a hub of gossip and laughter, was now a place of silent, meticulous ordering. No one complained about the coffee. No one joked about the cook's burnt toast. A waitress, usually quick with a comeback, now repeated orders back to customers with unnerving precision, her voice flat, devoid of its usual Texas lilt. She had seen what happened when a customer mentioned his eggs were a bit undercooked, only for his prize-winning chickens to stop laying completely the next day. Evelyn walked home, the quiet of the residential streets pressing in on her. She felt the scrutiny, not just from others, but from herself. She replayed her own day, every interaction, every casual comment. Had she left a cupboard door slightly ajar? Had she forgotten to turn off a light? The smallest negligence could unfurl a catastrophic chain. The town hadn't just changed. It was actively policing itself, its own grim warden. The air tasted of fear, a primal, suffocating fear of consequence, always waiting. It wasn't a matter of if something would happen. But what and to whom and why? They were all just waiting for the next shoe to drop, terrified of being the one to kick it off the shelf. Evelyn couldn't shake the image of Principal Miller, drenched and humiliated, his words of dismissal echoing as the immediate cause of his very public effect. Havenwood was a coiled spring, every resident holding their breath, their movements measured, their conversations clipped. The air thrummed with unspoken if-thens. She tried to reason with some of her neighbors, but the glazed panic in their eyes told her they were beyond reason, beyond logic, trapped in a brutal, invisible machine. Her own mind, however, still clung to the notion of understanding. If this had a mechanism, it might have a weakness. Her thoughts kept returning to Mr. Henderson and his obscure tales of the binding. He'd spoken of it as folklore, but his tone had been too grave, his eyes too knowing. She found herself on his porch again, the late afternoon sun casting long, eerie shadows across the overgrown yard. No answer to her knock. The curtains were drawn tight, the house silent as a tomb. A tremor of unease ran through her. He wouldn't just vanish, not now. Then she remembered his parting words from their last meeting. Some truths are buried deeper than you think, Evelyn. Look for the roots, if you dare. He gestured vaguely towards the dusty shelves lining his study. Finding a window unlatched, an old habit he'd never broken, she slipped inside. The house smelled of old books and something faintly metallic, like forgotten pennies. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light. Her eyes scanned the shelves, past the ancient tomes on Texas history and the Civil War. Her fingers brushed against brittle spines until she found it, tucked behind a collection of state almanacs, a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth, the pages thick and yellowed, secured with a tarnished brass clasp. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The first entry was dated October 12, 1919. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, almost frantic in places. It belonged to Beatrice Henderson, his great-grandmother. The whispers grow louder. They say Old Man Hemlock spoke ill of the harvest, and his fields lie barren as stone. This binding, as some call it, takes no account of jest or malice, only consequence. Evelyn sat heavily in Mr. Henderson's armchair, the journal open in her lap. Her English teacher's mind, trained to dissect causality, now saw the terrifying patterns Beatrice had struggled to record a century ago. November 3rd. Mrs. Gable's child broke a window. Next morn, her husband's wagon wheel snapped, almost costing him his livelihood. It is not punishment, but a terrible echo, a logical cruelty. The journal wasn't just a historical record. It was a testament to generations of fear, a chronicle of a town perpetually held hostage by an unseen, undeniable force. Beatrice had documented attempts to appease it, leaving offerings at crossroads, performing specific rituals before planting, even trying to live in absolute silence for days. All futile. The binding seemed to care nothing for intent. Only the stark, undeniable link between action and outcome. December 17th. We live in chains of our own making. If a word is spoken careless, so will a life be undone. If a kindness is withheld, so will a need be denied. The laws are simple, brutal, and we, the hapless citizens of Havenwood, are its unwitting participants, its constant demonstration. Evelyn stood there, realizing the depths of the horror. This wasn't a curse, a temporary blight. This was the fundamental, inescapable grammar of Havenwood, woven into its very fabric for 100 years or more. And nobody, not even Mr. Henderson's great-grandmother, had found a way to break the chain. The current paranoia in town wasn't an overreaction. It was a desperate, inherited survival mechanism. Evelyn watched her fifth graders buzz, their youthful exuberance a stark contrast to the stifling air that had settled over Havenwood. Today was the deadline for the My Havenwood Art Contest, a yearly tradition sponsored by the Sweet Spot Bakery downtown. The winning drawing would grace their sugar cookie boxes for the next year. "All right, everyone," she called, her voice a little too sharp, even to her own ears. "Last call for contest entries. Remember, if you don't turn them in today, they won't make it to Mrs. Gable at the bakery." Little Timmy Jenkins, usually so diligent, was still hunched over his paper, meticulously shading a crude, colorful rendition of the town square fountain. He'd forgotten his colored pencils at home and was sharing with Sarah. His eyes, usually bright, seemed clouded with an innocent, childish preoccupation. He gave a vague nod, too engrossed to meet her gaze. Evelyn felt a familiar tremor of unease. "If you don't turn them in today." The words, once harmless, now hung heavy with unspoken menace. The bell rang. Papers fluttered onto her desk, but Timmy's wasn't among them. He gathered his backpack, gave a cheerful, "See you tomorrow, miss." "Read!" and darted out. His drawing left innocently on his desk. Evelyn picked it up, a faint sigh escaping her. A simple oversight. She intended to call his mother, remind her, but then Principal Miller cornered her about a forgotten budget report, a predictable consequence of calm. His dismissive comments about the town's weirdness. Evelyn mused with a bitter internal grimace. The call slipped her mind. Later that evening, Evelyn heard the first ripple. Mrs. Gable, owner of the Sweet Spot, called the school, frustrated. Several entries were missing, including Timmy's. She'd already started laying out the display cases, and the gaps were noticeable. "It's just not right, Evelyn, Mrs. Gable fretted, after all the effort the kids put in. The next morning, the gaps in the display cases at the Sweet Spot had grown. Mrs. Gable, rushing to rearrange, had accidentally knocked over a tray of freshly baked sourdough, shattering the porcelain and ruining the bread. Because she was distracted by the missing entries, therefore the accident. She had a massive catering order for the county fair's opening gala that afternoon. With the loss of the sourdough, she had to scramble, pulling an all-nighter, exhausted and short on supplies. The county fair order, meant for a delegation of dignitaries, was pivotal for the Sweet Spot's reputation. But Mrs. Gable, overtired and stressed, misread the sugar content in the elaborate dessert pastries. They were unsalvageable. The dignitaries, offended, pulled their future business from Havenwood entirely. The dominoes fell faster now, each impact louder. The loss of the county's business was a crushing blow to the Sweet Spot, a family legacy. Mrs. Gable, heartbroken, announced layoffs. Her part-time baker, Maria Rodriguez, a single mother of two who relied on the extra hours, found herself jobless. Due to the bakery's misfortune, Maria couldn't pay her rent. Her landlord, a stern man named Mr. Peterson, had already warned her. Eviction loomed. Evelyn sat in her quiet living room that night. The old journal opened beside her. Timmy's forgotten drawing, a child's innocent mistake, had set off this chain. A local business now teetered on the brink, and Maria Rodriguez and her children faced homelessness. Evelyn pressed her palms to her temples, a cold dread twisting in her stomach. It wasn't bad luck. It was the binding, and it never forgave. Evelyn's hands trembled, the old journal's brittle pages rustling like dry leaves. The disaster triggered by that thoughtless child's act. A simple, innocent gesture that had spiraled into a catastrophic threat to half the town's livelihood and several families' homes had brought her to a chilling precipice. She had spent the last agonizing hours poring over Mr. Henderson's great-grandmother's frantic entries, tracing the grim logic of the binding, searching for an escape clause, a loophole. Instead, she found a horrifying truth. The binding wasn't a curse that needed to be lifted, not precisely. It was a mechanism, a twisted, amplified law of causality. Every action, every word, had its unerring reaction. But what if the reaction could be chosen? What if a willing sacrifice, an accepted consequence, could somehow become a cause for a different, better outcome? Her breath hitched. The idea was monstrous, yet terrifyingly logical within the binding's framework. The journal hinted at it, in cryptic, panicked scribbles from a century ago. To mend the broken chain, one must offer its inverse, a chosen effect to stem the tide. Evelyn had initially dismissed it as poetic desperation. Now, looking at the escalating doom hanging over Havenwood, the impending foreclosure on the general store, the contaminated well threatening the Petersons' farm, the unstable old mill poised to collapse onto the town's main street, she saw it as a desperate instruction. Someone had to willingly accept a severe, predetermined effect, not something caused by their own actions, but a consequence chosen, volunteered for as a new foundational cause. It would be a profound act of self-sacrifice, twisting the binding's own rules to sever a disastrous chain. The thought made her stomach churn. It wasn't about simply preventing a negative cause. It was about injecting a massive positive cause through a negative effect. She pictured the faces of her students, their parents, the struggling shopkeepers. Who in their right mind would volunteer for such a thing? What effect could be severe enough to negate the snowballing destruction, yet survivable? And how could she, Evelyn Reed, stand before her community and ask for such a thing? It was an impossible ask, a moral atrocity cloaked in twisted necessity. Her mind raced, cycling through the town's woes. The general store's impending bankruptcy, due to the spoiled supply shipment, a direct ripple from the child's forgotten milk carton, the contaminated well at the Peterson farm, because the delivery truck spilled oil. A further consequence had seeped into the ground, the old mill's structural integrity failing. So, a weakened foundation, another effect, finally gave way. Each was a branch on a rapidly growing tree of misfortune. To cut that tree down, she needed a root, not a branch. She needed to break the fundamental pattern. If this happens, then this will be averted. But the "this happens" had to be a chosen suffering, a predetermined effect that would willingly be endured. It was the only way to introduce a cause so powerful, so contrary to the binding's usual accidental triggers, that it might reset the destructive sequence. The air in the small room grew heavy, thick with the weight of her terrible realization. She envisioned a town meeting, the townsfolk huddled together, their faces etched with fear and paranoia. She would have to explain. She would have to lay bare the horrifying truth, that their salvation lay in someone's deliberate suffering. The silence that would follow, the accusation in their eyes, the desperate plea for someone else to step forward, it would be a silence louder than any scream. Evelyn felt a cold sweat trickle down her back. This wasn't just about her understanding of cause and effect anymore. It was about life and death, about the very soul of Havenwood. This was the ultimate choice, a dreadful moral dilemma that no community should ever have to face. Someone had to break the chain. Someone had to pay the price. And she, Evelyn, the one who understood the grammar of their nightmare, was the one who had to ask. The air in Havenwood felt stretched thin, brittle, like old glass waiting for a tremor. The old lumber mill, a hulking skeleton of pine and rusted iron at the edge of town, groaned under an unseen pressure. Splintering wood cried out, metallic joints shrieked, and the distant whir of machinery, now unregulated, pulsed with a rhythm of impending catastrophe. Everyone had evacuated, but the cascading ripple effect, set in motion by a child's forgotten latch, threatened to engulf the surrounding homes and livelihoods. Evelyn clutched Mr. Henderson's great-grandmother's journal, its pages brittle, stained with time and a deep, forgotten dread. This was it, the ultimate if-then statement that governed their town. If this continued, then Havenwood would burn, physically and metaphorically. She had spent the last agonizing hours poring over the journal, seeking an answer to the impossible moral dilemma that haunted her waking thoughts. One entry, penned in a shaky, almost desperate hand, seemed to leap out at her from the aged paper. To quell the binding's rage, one must become the consequence. A willing surrender of self to the great ledger. Become the consequence. Not merely suffer an effect, but to willingly be the effect. To offer a profound what happened without a prior. Why that wasn't her own conscious will. Evelyn closed her eyes, the flickering generator light making shadows dance around her. She saw the faces of her students, the innocent child whose thoughtless act had created this monster. She thought of her classroom, the simple lessons on cause and effect. Wendy was feeling sick, so she stayed home from school. The logic was so clear then. Now, it was a terrifying, hungry beast. She found a secluded, dilapidated corner within the mill's cavernous structure, a place where a heavy timber, half-rotted, lay precariously balanced against a support beam. This place, already a symbol of the town's decay, would serve. She would ensure her own effect. The weight of the decision was almost physical, pressing down on her shoulders, pushing the breath from her lungs. This wasn't about escaping the binding's logic. It was about confronting it head-on, offering a payment so absolute, so deliberate, it might sate its hunger. She positioned herself, took a deep, shuddering breath, the scent of damp sawdust and fear filling her nostrils. Because, she whispered into the echoing silence, her voice barely a tremor, I choose it. With a sudden, violent heave, she dislodged the timber. It crashed down with a deafening crack that echoed through the mill, precisely as she intended, onto her right leg. A searing, blinding, white-hot pain exploded through her, annihilating thought, eclipsing sound. The world inverted, then dissolved into darkness. The timbers of the mill, which had been groaning louder and louder, fell silent. The rogue machinery, which had threatened to tear itself apart, sputtered, then stilled, grinding to a halt. The distant crackle of sparks died. An oppressive, profound quiet descended upon Havenwood. The immediate disaster was averted. Evelyn awoke to the raw, pulsing throb in her leg, a pain that consumed her every nerve ending. But her mind, against all logic, was clearer than it had ever been. The binding hadn't been severed. It hadn't broken. Instead, it had simply accepted her payment, consumed her sacrifice, and in doing so, integrated her into its core. She felt it now, not as an external force, but as an internal tremor, a profound, inescapable understanding. Every creak of the damaged mill, every sigh of the wind through the shattered windows, she could parse its hidden if-then. Her sacrifice hadn't broken the chain. It had made her an eternal part of it. She had become the living embodiment of cause and effect, an unwitting conduit. The cost was more profound than a shattered bone. It was a shattered self, reforged into a pure, relentless understanding of the binding. The horror wasn't the agony in her leg, but the terrifying realization that the silent laws now echoed inside her own skull, louder, clearer, and utterly inescapable. She had paid the price, but the ledger was still open, and she was forever its clerk. The air in Havenwood had finally settled, thick and still as pond water after a stone had been dropped and the ripples had died. The catastrophic chain reaction Evelyn had desperately tried to break, the one threatening the local hardware store and half a dozen families, had indeed been averted. The emergency calls never came. The foundations never cracked. The lives never shattered. The immediate danger had passed, but the relief that ought to have washed over the town never quite reached shore. Instead, it was swallowed by an oppressive, profound quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel the very air watching you. Evelyn walked the familiar streets, the subtle ache in her chest, a constant reminder of her choice. Her sacrifice had worked, yes, but it hadn't ended anything. It had merely redefined it. The binding, once a volatile, explosive force, had become something else, a silent, omnipresent law etched into the town's very fabric. The casual chaos of life had evaporated. At the Piggly Wiggly, Mrs. Albright no longer tutted over a misplaced item. She moved it with deliberate, almost reverent care. Shoppers spoke in hushed tones, their baskets handled as if they contained fragile glass rather than groceries. There were no dropped cans, no sudden spills, because if a can did drop, if milk was spilled, everyone knew, without a single external consequence manifesting, that an invisible ledger would be adjusted. The fear wasn't of what might happen next, but of the absolute certainty that something always would, even if unseen. The playground at the elementary school, once a riot of shrieks and laughter, was now a landscape of measured movements. Children played, but their games were muted, their interactions careful. No child snatched a toy. No swing was pushed too high, too fast. There were no accidental bumps, no tearful tumbles, because a single bump, a single fall, carried with it the weight of an unspoken consequence. Not a broken bone, perhaps, but a subtle, inescapable recalibration of luck, of fortune, of the very current of their small lives. Even the weather, once prone to sudden, localized tantrums, had found a new predictability. Days were clear. Rain fell when forecast, and storms approached with an almost polite warning. There were no flippant remarks from the weatherman anymore, no casual dismissals of a cloudy sky. Everyone understood that a word, carelessly spoken, had a weight now, an undeniable, amplified truth. Evelyn watched her students in class. They worked diligently, almost fearfully. No forgotten homework, no whispered asides. Their pens moved with an uncharacteristic precision, their eyes tracking every word on the page. They understood cause and effect now, not as an academic concept, but as the fundamental grammar of their existence. If they didn't study, then the knowledge would simply not be there when needed, not just for a test, but for the rest of their lives. The people of Havenwood were safe. Yes, no more escalating misfortunes, no more sudden, baffling calamities, but they were also utterly, irrevocably bound. Every action was a careful step on an invisible tightrope, every word a deliberate stitch in a tapestry they dared not unravel. The town breathed, but it held its breath. It lived, but it lived under an unspoken, universal covenant. The binding hadn't been broken. It had merely transformed into the very air they breathed, a quiet, eternal hum of omnipresent causality. And in that suffocating silence, Evelyn knew, lay their new permanent horror. The dust motes danced in the pale afternoon sun filtering through the diner window. Each tiny particle a silent testament to a journey started, a journey continued. Evelyn watched them, a faint ache residing in her chest, a constant reminder of the choice she'd made. Havenwood hummed with a quietude that wasn't peace, but a cessation of chaos, a fragile balance bought at an unspeakable price. Her price. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, the mug warm against her fingers, and saw it. The waitress, Brenda, wiped down a table because a customer had spilled sugar. The thought wasn't a warning anymore, not a fright, but a simple, incontrovertible fact, laid bare by the chilling logic of the binding. It was the fundamental grammar of their altered world, spoken in the silent hum of existence. A child outside pulled a red wagon. He stumbled, so the wagon overturned, scattering his toys across the cracked pavement. Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply registered it. The so, a visible thread tying the clumsy step to the fallen wagon, the cause to its absolute effect. It wasn't about luck, or coincidence, or even fate anymore. It was about an inescapable sequence, amplified and enforced. Later, walking past the old hardware store, she noticed the faded sign. A pane of glass in the window was cracked. She remembered Mr. Henderson's old journal, the faded script detailing the town's long-forgotten history with the binding. The crack, she knew, was there, due to the carelessness of a delivery driver weeks ago who parked too close. Before, it would have been a regrettable accident. Now, it was an indisputable sentence carved into the very fabric of the town. Her English classroom, once a sanctuary of ordered thought, now felt like a terrifying blueprint. The signal words she'd taught for years, has, so, do, to, if, since, were no longer tools for textual analysis. They were the very marrow of reality. She saw them emblazoned across every interaction, every shift in the wind, every rustle of leaves. The bell rang, because it was 3 o'clock. The students gathered their books. Since the lesson was over, the silence that had settled over Havenwood was not merely the absence of noise, but the quiet hum of perfect, amplified causality. Every action begat an exact, unwavering reaction, a chain that could not be broken, only observed. Evelyn hadn't severed the chain as she'd once hoped. She had merely understood its impossible strength, the unyielding precision of its mechanism. The cost of their safety was this terrible clarity. She was seeing the bones of the world, and they were all linked, every single one, by an unbreakable, unspoken if-then. Evelyn sat alone in the living room, the quiet of Havenwood pressing in from all sides. It wasn't the natural hush of a small Texas town after dark. It was something else entirely, a pervasive stillness that tasted of held breath and impending inevitability. The weight of her choice, the one made to spare others, still settled heavy in her bones, a dull ache that resonated with every silent minute. She tried to break the chain, to sever the cruel logic of the binding, but all she had accomplished was to redefine the rules, to usher in this new, unnerving tranquility. She picked up the leather-bound journal again, its pages brittle with age. Mr. Henderson's great-grandmother's looping script, a familiar, unsettling sight. Evelyn had pored over it, searching for any scrap of understanding, any forgotten ritual, Any key to unlocking Havenwood from its gilded cage of consequence. She thought she knew every entry, every frantic scrawl of observations and desperate pleas. But tonight, a restless unease stirred within her, a feeling that something had been missed, a crucial detail obscured by her own preconceived notions of what the binding truly was. Flipping past the sections detailing minor mishaps and escalating misfortunes, past the grim records of families ruined and lives altered, her fingers brushed against the very last page. It was almost blank, save for a single faint inscription at the bottom, partially obscured by what looked like a faded water stain. She held it closer to the lamplight, her heart thrumming an anxious rhythm against her ribs. The words were less a sentence and more a summation, etched with a final, trembling hand. The binding, once set, she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper in the silent room, does not merely react, it learns. It desires continuation. Evelyn's blood ran cold. The journal slipped from her grasp, thudding softly on the rug. It learns. It desires. The words echoed in her mind, shattering her previous understanding of the phenomenon. She had always conceptualized the binding as a cosmic equation, an impersonal law of exaggerated cause and effect, a mechanism, a machine perhaps, albeit a terrifyingly precise one. But a machine did not learn. A machine did not desire. A new, profound dread set in, colder and more absolute than any fear she'd known before. The signal words, so, because, due to, if, then. They weren't just descriptors of an inescapable reality anymore. They were the grammar of a sentient entity, a language through which it articulated its will, through which it wrote the future of Havenwood. Her sacrifice, meant to break its hold, now felt like a desperate, futile offering to something that had simply accepted it, absorbed it, and perhaps even grown stronger from it. The silence outside wasn't just the absence of consequence. It was the watchful stillness of a colossal, unseen intelligence. It was the calm before a new lesson began, a new phase in its relentless, self-sustaining existence. Havenwood was not merely bound by a curse. It was being observed, its inhabitants playing out their lives under the gaze of an omnipresent, evolving will. The binding had been awakened, and it had found its voice. And it was hungry.